Hi, everyone. This is Marilyn Bradford, and I would like to welcome you to my Left Turn podcast. What is your left turn? Writing a blog, parenting in a different way, letting go of the old because you are aware of something greater. Left turns are choices we can all make. It's about a willingness to step into the unknown in any area of your life, to trust yourself, to risk creating or trying something new. It's about letting your true uniqueness shine. The greatest people who have lived, artists, statesmen, writers, explorers, musicians, have all been people willing to turn left. What capacities do you have that you have not acknowledged? What would your life and the world be like if you were willing to turn left? Hi, everybody. It's Marilyn Bradford with another edition of the Left Turn podcast. And this time, my friend Tracy asked me if I would be the one interviewed and she would be doing the interview. So here we are.
Yeah, so when the podcaster becomes the podcast-e. Hello, everybody. I've been in your brains, and I know that you guys are very curious about Marilyn. So I wanted to be here to be the mouth of all of the curiosities about Marilyn. So thank you so much, Marilyn, for saying yes to this. I know it's been a lot of people's asks. So the first thing that I want to ask you actually is, where did the name Left Turn come from? For anyone who's just tuning in and like maybe doesn't know, but they resonate with the energy of what that is, can you maybe share like where that name came from?
Yes, it came from my desire to do a podcast that celebrated the people of access and sometimes beyond. And wasn't just, okay, this time we're doing money and this time we're doing family and this, I mean, not that there aren't some great podcasts that do that, but I really wanted to interview individuals who had taken their lives in their own hands, basically, and had chosen, based on what they knew to be true for them, the next steps in their life, even if other people objected or said they were crazy or anything like that. And of course, in a way, the model was Gary Douglas. Everyone told him everything he did with Access Consciousness and starting it and the way he runs his business is crazy and insane and it'll never work. And he's like, and now we're in 176 countries and making multiple millions every year. But Gary always followed what he knew to be true for him. And that's what I wanted to interview people about. What do you know to be true for you, no matter what this reality or anybody else says? So I needed a name. And I went through all kinds of this, and that's not really it. And finally, I was flying out to Rome, I believe, and I spent the night at a hotel, a Sheraton in Albuquerque, because the first leg was an early morning flight. And I walked downstairs to get something to eat, and the name of the restaurant was Left Turn. And I just went, boink. And it just goes to show, if you're trying to figure out in your head, it doesn't really work. But if you're willing, if you just ask a question, which is what Access is based on, okay, where am I going to find the name for this podcast? And that's exactly what happened. And I knew it immediately.
That's so cool. Oh my God, I love hearing that. And like the fact that you were at that place and
Yes.
they had that restaurant is not a coincidence. It's like you said, it's following the energy. So here we
Yes.
are on Left Turn, which is such a perfect name for the energy of this podcast. So I guess I'm going to turn the tables on you, Marilyn. So when you hear Left Turn, and we've talked about the energy, what's the first thing that pops into your awareness about like your own left turn?
Well, the first thing that pops into my awareness is that as a child, I was kind of afraid to take left turns and to follow what I knew to be true for me. I was the youngest in the family, youngest on the block, youngest in all the relatives. And it seemed like everybody was always telling me what to do and telling me I was wrong. And I kind of shrunk down. And then I began to go, you know what? Maybe I'm not so wrong and they're not so right. And it was kind of a gradual awakening for me. But one of the biggest, and in a way, people would call it most radical left turns, um, was when I was in my late 20s, and I hopped on an airplane to go to India to see this guru and stay there for 6 months, whose name was Rajneesh. And I thought I knew some people who were gonna be there. They ended up not going. So, essentially, I did the whole thing on my own, and I got there, and I just followed the energy. I found a place to stay for a while. I knew I was gonna have to move, but I kept asking questions. I got a bicycle because everybody uses bicycles. And I had an amazing 6 months. Some of the things well, it was the first time I'd actually experienced no judgment. And this particular guru really had no judgment. And I'd never, that was a foreign energy to me. Now, a lot of the people who were there had judgments,
Mhm.
but he didn't. I'm like, wow, what if I live my life without judgment? There was so much inspiration. And when you go to a really foreign country, and you with there weren't very many Americans there at that time. There were Europeans, there were people from India, there were a few from Australia, but a handful of Americans.
So, can I ask a question? Was that your first time leaving the country, or had you left the country before?
No, my father was a professor of geology at Princeton, and every, I think it's 10 years, we would have a sabbatical. And those happened when I was 3 to 4 and then 13 to 14. And both times we went to Italy.
Oh,
So when I was like 4, I went to an Italian nursery school because there was nothing English speaking in Florence. And I'm like, Quanta Costa, the words I use were all about going to the candy shop, with
wow,
my
smart.
parents. Yeah, but I learned a few. And then when I was in the 13, 14, I was in boarding school, an international boarding school in Switzerland. That was an interesting experience. I just think I feel sorry for people who don't travel because you miss so much. Um, so in the dormitory were 3 Arabian princesses who used to yell out in the middle of the night in Arabic. It was
Really?
very interesting.
You're talking about the boarding school.
The boarding school, yes.
Wow.
And some of the, I won't say names, but we had some very famous people's children there from, I mean, from around the world. It
Right.
was that kind of boarding school, but it was also, they would arrive in their Rolls Royces and I would arrive in our Volkswagen, but that was all right.
Wow, that kind of sounds like a left turn though, because like what an experience like you talk about. Like some people don't leave the country until they're like 20. That's why I like asked you that. And you were at this boarding school with all these different mix of different kinds of people. Like,
Yes.
wow, what an experience at such a young, you said 13 and 14?
Yeah. Yeah. And in
Wow.
fact, there was only one other American there, I believe. It's
Wow.
hard to remember exactly, but we just all made friends because why would you not? And learned
Hmm.
about their backgrounds and, how life was for them. And I found a kind of a universality there.
Hmm.
You tend to think, well, the rich kids are going to be really different. No, they just have more stuff. They have the same, they have the same family issues,
Yeah.
that you do.
Wow. What a great perspective to have at such a young age.
Yes, it
Because
really,
even now, people still have that point of view, right? That like rich people don't have problems, you know? They just have money, but they don't have anything else, you know, they're perfect and all like all these things. So at such a young age to see people with different kinds of wealth too, you know what I mean?
yes,
Like
yes.
in different kinds of ways. And then just to see that they have very similar things going on in their life.
And status. I mean, some of these were people of like presidential type status of their parents and just, you know, royalty basically.
Wow. Okay. And then you mentioned going to India. Did you know it was going to be for 6 months, or were you just like going for a shorter trip and then it turned out to be 6 months?
I don't actually remember. I think I did know it was going to be for 6 months, or at least a much longer period than a few weeks, because at that time, my attitude was, if I only go for 3 weeks or a month, how am I really going to immerse myself in all of this. It'll be so easy just to keep my American persona
Yeah.
that doesn't seem really worthwhile.
Wow. What an interesting perspective that it won't be enough time to immerse myself in this country and this culture. Like, where do you think that perspective came from? Like, or where do you know it came from inside of you?
Well, I used to attribute it to having traveled as a child, because because he was a field geologist, that means you got to go out there and chip rocks and stuff. He and a couple of other professors from different universities founded this geology camp a mile up a mountain in Montana. And that's where I spent all my childhood summers. And that was a very different experience because you talk about rural. I mean, we really had to learn to entertain ourselves. There certainly was no media, even television, but we could hike and we had played horseshoes and played games and went, I learned to shoot a rifle and all kinds of things like that. Um, so I can't even remember your question. How did I come to that awareness of that desire? My sense now is that I always had it and I kind of squished it down
Mm,
because of the way of the family structure, the neighborhood structure, the school structure, and all of that. And it just began to emerge. I liked the idea of, meeting these new people and people from different backgrounds. And um, so I think that was really part of it. I think that's always been there for me.
mm. Yeah, that's so interesting because I was having a conversation with a few people this week and we were talking about global awareness.
Mhm.
And it's like some people have that global vision or that global awareness, and some people seem to not have it as much. And it's
Right.
not like one is right and one is wrong. It's just they're just different. So when you have that global awareness or that global vision, you can just perceive the world in a different way,
Yes.
and it seems like you just had that or you've tapped into that and have now are tapping into it even more,
Yes.
which is such an interesting thing. So you were talking about India because I'm sure India was a cultural shock coming from the
It
States.
wasn't actually. I don't know
No?
what it is about me, but I'm not. Two things about me. I don't seem to be intimidated by much of well, I don't want to run into a lion that's attacking me, but even by other people. I think, if I met famous people, I'm just not intimidated.
Mm,
And the other thing is, I'm not shocked by much. It's much more like, oh, this is different. Okay. What do I need to learn? What do I need to be aware of here? And it was. I mean, there are a lot of beggars, and this now we have a lot of homeless. So in a way, it's not that different. But
mhm,
there was the whole culture, and even though theoretically they didn't have the caste system, they had the caste system.
mm.
So still, it was like I learned to find food that I liked, and oh my gosh, some of their food is so hot. People think they have regular Indian food from India here. So I had to stick with biryanis and things like that, rice dishes and
Yeah, so how did that trip to India, like looking back on it now, and I don't mean like looking back, but just like if you could like kind of just, like zoom out and like look at your life from like a bird's eye view.
Mhm.
And we talked about how that was like a left turn.
Yes.
What did that left turn create for you, like going to India?
It created a sense that there are always other possibilities.
Mm,
Hey, I went to India. What else could I do? I could become an auto mechanic. I could go to Japan and study the geishas. I could do almost anything. And I'm not going to say that I've always been and that I always was willing to be that space, but there was an element. You take Italy and Montana and India, and I was done with that by the time I was 30. It it's just different. It just gives you a greater perspective. And when you were talking about the sense of globalness or not, my sense is if you're not willing to have a global awareness, you're really limiting yourself because it's like you're inside of a box and you think, oh, the box is all there is.
Um,
Well, I better put this in this corner of the box and wait a minute, there's a knock on the box door, but I don't know, and that doesn't really fit into my box, so I don't think I'm going to answer the door. I think it's very limiting to not push yourself to have more of a global awareness,
mm,
because then you're making decisions, like even now, about the things that are going on in the world, and you may not have as much information as would be helpful. And I've run into people like that who are otherwise intelligent, and we start talking about politics or this or that. And I'm like, seriously? What about this? Oh, no, that didn't happen. It's like people who believe we never landed on the moon.
mm.
Uh, or I had one person tell me how wonderful, kind, and non-racist Donald Trump was. I'm like, hello, I don't think we're on the same wavelength there. It was just,
Yeah, well, that goes to show you too, like if you don't have a global perspective, your points of view are going to be very different.
yes,
And
exactly.
it'll be like speaking a different language. It'll literally be like sometimes it's like
Yes,
literally speaking a different language.
absolutely.
Um,
Because words you're saying mean different things. And the paradigms, the filters that people speak through become more and more dense the smaller their worlds are.
mhm. Yeah, that's so interesting. So yeah, like if so you said that like, you've had that global perspective since you were young, which is honestly such a blessing in disguise because
Yes.
especially now I'm thinking about kids like growing up in COVID, it's like they're more prone to like want to have this kind of I don't know how to if you're not watching this and you're just hearing, I'm kind of doing this like shrinking motion because it's
Right.
like you just like kind of like want to stay small.
Yes.
So I'm just curious, like, do you have any advice for people that maybe want more of that global perspective but didn't have the same experience as you had, where like, certain things would absolutely shock people
Mhm.
to see like especially in India where just there's so much like out on display everywhere.
Yes.
It's very
Yeah.
different. Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of things that are very different than North American culture. And I know people from all around the world are tuning into this podcast. But for like if you're in North America, it can be like I heard so many people who have gone there who have told me like it's quite shocking. So
Yeah.
the fact that you were like, I wasn't really shocked by it, I mean, that's a huge scale, but I mean, do you have any tips for anyone who's like, wow, I would like to have more of that global perspective, but it doesn't come that easy for me.
Travel.
Mm,
And if you can start out traveling somewhere that is not that different, but different enough that it asks you to stretch yourself a little bit.
mm,
Um, I was just in it, like just North America. I was just in a class, well, a few months ago in Mexico City. And what I did was find some guides. I took one day off before and one day off after, find some guides to take me to some of the museums and monuments and just around the city. And
mm,
that's a great way. Hire a guide or get in a guided tour and do something non-American. Uh, it's just, you can start small. Um, there's so much information on the internet. I almost hesitate to recommend that. But like, if you're interested in politics, listen to the right wing and listen to the left wing and see if you can do it without coming to conclusion on either of them.
mm,
Because that's what people do. They tend to identify, oh yeah, they're right. Oh yeah, they're really wrong. They're stupid. They're like evil dark horse or something. No, you know. So it's helpful to listen to different points of view about any topic
mm,
and not buy what somebody outside of you says is true as true. That's one thing I've really had to learn the hard way. Well, this expert said, and then you find out they don't know what they're talking about. And that
mm,
comes back to trusting you and making sure you allow you to follow what you know is true for you and don't get sidelined or bamboozled by the experts.
mm. Yeah, You've done so much travel. I mean, there's so much travel we've talked about, not even on this podcast. You just kind of brought up, and I've been there and I've gone here, and you've done
Right.
all these things, and it's just it's so cool. So I guess is there another like left turn in your life where you're like, wow, this really changed everything for me as well, like after the whole experience in India?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones was getting sober, going to a 12-step program. I think I was in it like 16 or 17 years. Finding out that while it's appropriate for some people who really desire a structure, some people really desire to be told what to do.
Right.
And 12-step is not that different from the dogma of a religion. You do this, you believe this, you're powerless, only a higher power can save you, blah, blah, blah. But being in that and finally going, you know what? I know there's something different and better here.
Mm.
So then I started asking myself questions. And after, I can't remember how many years I'd been, quote, sober before I found access consciousness, but it was a while. But by that point, I was a psychotherapist in private practice, and I started using the access tools with my clients, and they were getting better faster. And I had quite good training in psychotherapy. I was at the Menninger Clinic for my internship. And I was like, well, what else could I look at here? And I kept talking to Gary Douglas. And finally I said, hey, my clients are getting better with the access tools than they were with any other psychotherapy method I've tried. And I'd even looked at that point at like Women for Sobriety and rational emotive therapy for sobriety and all of those kinds of things. And each one of them had a little that, you could use. But I approached Gary Douglas and I said, can we do something in access with addiction? And he was like, sure. And at that point, there was one right class. It was Right Body for You. And it was done by someone hasn't been in access in a long time. So I said, well, what about Right Recovery for You? He said, yeah, I think I'm going to do a whole bunch of right classes. And that's actually how the right classes were born.
Wow.
And then I just kept asking questions and realizing things like the primary addiction is to wrongness and the judgment of self, or judgment and the wrongness of self, which is why people who don't know about these kinds of things, because 12-step not only doesn't address that, it doesn't address the body, and you have to address the body if you're going to deal with addiction, but it also makes people wrong.
Mm.
So not to dwell on that, I just kept building it and building it and building it and finding out different things. One thing I realized that addiction is just an energy looking for a target. That's all. It's an energy where people want to kind of absent themselves from definitely from their bodies, but from their being, and go to an outer source, whether it's alcohol and drugs, or it's trauma drama, or it's being perfect, or it's being famous, or it's making lots of money, or it's being the healthiest person on the block. You're not present. It's all about not being present. And for me, real recovery is not about stopping something unless it's truly harming you, at which point I'd say, okay, if you're not ready to give up addiction, let's just change your addiction. Why don't you start running, or doing
Mm.
something besides drugs, which are not a good idea. But anyway, that's been building, and Gary encouraged me to write a book, which I did. And that's been a huge left turn. One of the things about, some left turns, and this one in particular, I think all left turns really, is that it's not, you don't do something and that's the answer and you stop. It just keeps going and going. Well, what else could I discover? How else could we look at this? I have this company with Access, Right Recovery for You, and a team. We just are started, or actually are in the middle of redoing the business completely, which is so fun because I was getting bored. And
Mm.
people change and access changes. And what worked 3 years ago was not going to work now.
Right.
So
And I just want to go back because you talk about one left turn, but I heard like, 10. I mean, because there's so many different left turns. Like you talk about yourself having an addiction and then seeking help, which can be for some people a left turn,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
And then doing the whole like 12 steps, which is, the thing that everyone talks about, everyone knows
Mhm.
about, and then being like, that didn't actually work for me.
Yeah.
All like, and I'm just pointing out some of the ones that I heard, that to me could even be a left turn, like the courage it takes to be like, I tried that, didn't work, but then keeping on looking for something different without
Yes.
making yourself wrong. And I'm
Yes.
sure there were moments in between where you still did make yourself wrong, but ultimately keeping like seeking for that other thing without
Yeah.
making
Being in the
yourself
question.
yeah, just being in that question after going through all of that, like, there's a question here, I'm trying to formulate it, but it's like, because you talk about the awareness that came from that experience of like the primary addiction is to judgment of self, right? Like,
Yes.
was that from your own experience going through it?
Yes. And um, it was also helpful to be using the access tools. And access talks a lot about getting out of judgment.
Mm,
So it was both me. What if I'm not wrong? What if being wrong keeps everyone stuck and limited? So that got me to begin to explore judgment. And what happens if you don't judge? What's a reality beyond polarity and judging everything as good or bad or right or wrong? If I'm not doing that, who am I and what am I doing? And that was a big internal left turn.
mm. Can you say more about that? Because I've never heard you talk about it in that way.
Well, when we're questioning, it's not just about the world beyond us. Like, how do I change this living situation? Or what can I be and do to find a job I like more? It's really about examining our points of view. Because if we've decided that we're wrong, that's a huge limitation. And we can't acknowledge where we've done really cool, wonderful things. If we've decided if we have an addiction to being right, we've severely limited what we can receive from the world. So you've got to start with you on the inside. Oh,
Mm,
what is my point of view about this? What if that wasn't my point of view? One of the things that I often tell people, like when they come for sessions, is like they might come in and they might say, um, oh, I just have this craving to, eat a gallon of ice cream. And I say, okay, one, you can eat a gallon of ice cream. What if you did that and didn't judge yourself? But two, if you go underneath that craving, what are you aware of? Oh, I'm kind of unhappy with this, or I don't know how to handle this, or whatever it is. Okay, so what points of view do you have keeping the I don't know how to handle this in place?
mm.
So you just keep examining what your points of view are, and what would you be aware of if you didn't have those points of view? And how would your life be different?
Wow, this is so cool. And what's interesting? As a chiropractor, because I'm a chiropractor, I didn't really say that, but I noticed that
Mhm.
very similarly with the body. Like
Yes,
you mentioned something like if you're gonna, deal with addiction, you have to also include the like body.
yes,
As a chiropractor, if someone had a body thing, it was never unrelated to anything else.
exactly.
Even though people tried to sell me on this is my and if you can't see me, I'm pointing in one direction here, like, "This is my body issue that I came here for, fix it.
Yes,
Don't look at this.
right,
They're separate," and they would do all the dance and be like, "It's separate, it's not connected." And every time, Marilyn, it was never not connected.
exactly.
Even though they tried to sell me that it's just back pain,
Yes,
it's like, "But you can't bend over in your child's crib and connect with your daughter."
right.
So is it just your back pain, or is it also the fact that you can't connect with your daughter?
Yeah.
And that was only the surface level. Obviously, there's
Yes,
something
yes,
way beneath that, but people would be like, "Oh, yeah, that's actually what brought me here. It's not the
yes,
back pain, it's the fact that I can't connect with my daughter."
yes.
You know what I mean? And
Oh,
I'm a
absolutely.
chiropractor, and I'm just like, they didn't teach us about this part in school." But anyway, I just I love that. And when I'm hearing you speak, I'm like, oh, it's interesting. You know how we talked about that global perspective? And like you were talking about, like, if you have this need to be right, you
Yes.
might not want a global perspective.
Oh, absolutely. It's too challenging
It's
to
too
your image.
challenging. It's too
Yeah.
challenging to that. And I've never really seen that before, like in that way. So I really appreciate you saying that because I'm like, wow, that is so interesting. Um,
They can't allow anything that challenges their point of view into their universe. And if you're interested in left turns, you have to have courage. And I know lots of people with left turns who have courage. I
right.
mean, you have to have it.
Yeah.
And you have to be willing to let go of some of these fixed points of view and judgments and wrongness of self or wrongness of others.
Yeah, and I think I'm just hearing this differently today too, because as you're talking about all of your left turns, it's like, and then we talk about judgment. It's like if you had judgment as your primary point of view, it's like, would that left turn have even happened in that way? Or could it have even happened in that way? I'm getting like a probably not.
No. You have to have curiosity
Yeah.
and wonder and the willingness to change anything and everything.
Yeah. Wow. And that curiosity and wonder about yourself.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's
Wow. Why would I do that?
Yeah, because it's like in some ways, like I can even look at for me, like where I have my addiction to, like my like phone, right? Like
Mhm.
I'll find myself just picking up my phone and not even being like, what?
Yeah.
And in that moment, being like, what am I not present with? That I
Yes.
think that this thing, or I've been programmed that this thing will kind of like fill in. Um, so yeah, I guess this has been a really interesting conversation. It went in different directions than I thought it was gonna go.
Of
But I
course.
I love where we kind of ended because when anybody in access consciousness or who does access like hears about addiction, they usually think of you
Yeah.
because this has been something that you've been very proactive in sort of talking about and
Yes.
making bringing light to it and bringing awareness to it because it's an area where people have a lot of judgment.
Yes.
Like even me, like I wanted to judge myself for looking at my phone,
Right.
right? But it's like that doesn't change
Anything.
the behavior, but it's like we've been so programmed to think that if we judge ourselves enough,
Yeah.
we can change something.
It never
And
works.
it's like, but it's like, when has that worked, But it's like when I've made my own personal like left turns, not to make this about me, I've actually I've noticed for myself, that's
Yes.
when I don't judge myself.
Yes, exactly. Very good point. Thank you, Tracy, with that.
Yeah, so it's like I can allow myself to have that global perspective or a bigger perspective in that 10 seconds
Yes.
and choose something very weird. But it's
Yes.
like the judgment is what doesn't allow me to like see that.
Yeah.
And that's really cool. And I'm so grateful for you for talking about this and continuing the like conversation because I just see like addiction is something we're all willing to look at now. You know how like
Some people.
before some people, but I mean way more than before, like it's an actual conversation that some people are willing to hear, which I think is
Yes. Yes.
cool that we can actually talk about it and people are willing to look at these things. I think that's like the coolest thing.
Well, thank you. Me too, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a bigger, more global conversation about like mental health.
Yes.
And that's, I mean, it's gonna, I guess, take steps
Yeah.
to change that, but I think it's cool that we're moving in a direction that we can talk about it. So
Yes.
you are one of those voices that always adds humor to it, which I think, and not to dismiss it, it's just like, again, I've noticed that when you don't judge and when you like laugh, I've changed more than if I tried to make something super serious.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's only my point of view, but I just want to thank you for always bringing levity and just kindness to a conversation that can be really heavy and really serious for a lot of people.
Well, thank you for that, Tracy. And thank you for kind of giving me a shove to do this interview. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and I hope you guys all learned something about Marilyn and her travels. And thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in.
Thank you so much for joining this episode of Left Turn. I wonder what embracing left turns could create in your life. What magical possibilities might show up. Remember, when you choose left turns, you are joining a group of the most creative and brilliant people the world has ever known.